It's my job today to introduce the final keynote talk by Professor Ken Roberts. Last but certainly not least, when Gail and Susan and Tracy and me tried to put the panel of keynote speakers together, Ken was one of the first people on the list, and we were extremely pleased when he agreed to do this. His talk is going to be entitled Youth and Youth Research Then and Now, a 60-year retrospective. I'll pass over to Ken in a moment, but before his talk we have a surprise for him. You don't know about? Yes, stay there.
I don't like surprise.
No, I know you don't. That's why I didn't tell you. So I'll come to this. So we have an award, which I'll explain in a moment. But Ken once said to me at a conference, or said to the conference, I forget when or where it was, that youth sociologists typically have more than one string to their bow. They're usually not just youth sociologists. They have interests perhaps in the sociology of labour markets or gender or family as well. Now, I don't know if that's still true, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And certainly Ken works across three distinct but linked fields. The sociology of class, the sociology of leisure, and the sociology of youth. And he's been a distinguished and leading figure globally in all of those areas. But today, we're talking about Ken and the sociology of youth. Ken is someone whose work and presence in the field Dan and Tracy and I have enormous admiration and respect for. Tracy's sorry that she can't be here. She had to leave because of a bereavement. People might not know that Ken was one of Tracy's PhD examiners. Ken was kind enough to write a chapter in a book for me many years ago, 1997. I had an edited book about the idea of a youth underclass, and Ken's chapter in that book made it a much more rounded, challenging and provocative book than it perhaps otherwise would have been. And Dan, when I was putting this together, reminded me that Ken is one of the journal's keenest, most energetic and most valued reviewers. Some metrics. He's always generous in responding to requests, 99% agreed, and ultra efficient in returning reviews. Average time, 1 day, 3 hours. Other reviewers, please take note. Folk definitely won't know that Ken was probably the reason I first got interested in youth sociology. I don't know if you know this, Ken, either. It's a long, long time ago in a galaxy far away. I had to do an undergraduate dissertation. I wasn't a studious student, probably the opposite. I couldn't really think of anything to do. Yeah? Then I read in the paper, I think it must have been back at Mum and Dad's house, a headline to a news story that young people were learning to live with unemployment. I thought, that's not right. This was 1982. I thought, that's not right, and it's also a politically dangerous sort of thing to be saying. Thatcher will just leave them to it. I later discovered that this was a report, probably a misreport, of a paper that Ken had delivered, I think, at the 1982 BSA conference. I'm not going to hold you to it because I think it was a misreport. But anyway, that became the focus of my dissertation, youth unemployment. And when I couldn't get a proper job, it became the focus of my PhD. Now, more or less one way or another since then, it's been the focus of my whole academic career. So, for better or worse, Ken, you're the one who kick-started it all off for me. As part of the conference notes, we have some biographies. And it says there that Ken is one of the most experienced youth researchers in the world, and I think that's undoubtedly the truth. I can't think of anybody who is more experienced than Ken in youth research. He's I have to count this up, but astonishingly, Ken has been writing and publishing about youth transition, youth unemployment, the labour market, for 7 decades. Is that right, Ken? Can that be true? I think it must be.
Latest entry was that.
Yeah. So he's been directed or been involved with research projects in the UK, in Eastern and Western Europe, in the ex-Soviet republics, and more recently in North Africa. This international sweep to his work allows for critical comparative youth sociology. So, for example, a key message of the book called Youth in Transition 2009, which drew on multiple quantitative and qualitative research projects from several countries in East and Western Europe, was how, well, a central message was how that we in the West, perhaps we might call it the global North now, should look to Eastern European societies for our path of development, not the other way round. So, for instance, if we look at the spread of graduate underemployment in the UK, that was a phenomenon that was first developing in the Soviet and Eastern Europe. There are many things that I love about Ken and his work. His writing and his lecturing is marked by clarity and accessibility. It's not full of jargon and obfuscation, and I hope you don't let me down today. He asks and answers central questions about why we as sociologists might want to even study youth in the first place. He speaks with authority and can be provocative. Ken isn't at the whim of scholarly fads and fashions. I don't mean this in a nice way. I think he's decidedly anti-fashion. Again, in the bio for the conference, which Ken wrote, he notes simply that, quote, his consistent position has been that how young people's lives unfold depends more on opportunity structures than aspirations or choices. Amen. That's a deceptively simple but extremely important position, and it has enormous theoretical and significant ramifications. But it's a position or a way of thinking that's often missed and got wrong by policymakers, by politicians, and sometimes also by youth researchers. So it's a great honour for me, just to wrap up, on behalf of the journal, on behalf of Dan and Tracy, to present to Ken a Lifetime Achievement Award for your contribution to the field of youth studies. We have a few gifts. Of course, we have a certificate. And we have, I'll be quite honest with you, this is an IOU. This is not, just wait there for a sec. This is an IOU. This is from Taylor and Francis, our publishers. It's a token of their appreciation of your work. So you can open that up later. Most importantly, we have a few gifts from the Man City shop. So Ken, like me, is a City fan, and I just checked beforehand, we are still top of the league. So if you don't want any of these, you can happily pass them back over. There's all sorts of these, Man City socks and everything. So please join me in congratulating Ken on his Lifetime Achievement Award. Over to you, Ken. Shall we just put these down there, or just leave it there?
I think I should sit down immediately. and leave it to Rob to talk about me. Am I going?
Yeah.
Okay. You can imagine that I've been in youth studies for a long time. I do go back to the age when I wrote manuscripts in handwriting and took them up to the office for typing. Before long I had my own typewriter, but I still had to take my script to the office and then they could do it properly. I think it's only since the 1990s that at Liverpool we've all had PCs in our offices that are loaded with Word, and PowerPoint came later. I went to and presented at my first conference at Wolverhampton in 1968. Of course, there was no PowerPoint then, and not even overhead projector. So we just had to use the blackboard on which we could write our main headings if we wanted to. So I've compromised today. And this is PowerPoint. You will recognize it. But it is just main headings, and then we rely upon me. Now I'm afraid I've got no visual images, and I've got no Technicolor, and there's no video. There's just me. I got into it. I kind of stumbled into youth research in 1964. One week I got a letter from LSE. You got these messages by letter, mail at that time, to give me my degree results from my bachelor degree. Good. Then a week later I got another letter that was offering me a postgraduate studentship, and I was always going to say yes to that. Otherwise, I was going to work for the Home Office in the research section, but postgraduate work, which could lead to an academic career, was always going to win hands down. At that time, there was no ESRC. A variety of government, public, and other bodies had awarded gifted scholarships to specific universities and departments, sometimes with conditions attached. And the condition on mine was that my research had to be about economic life, broadly defined. And I decided to study young people's entry into employment. I'll explain why in a minute. But that was not a highly fashionable research area. Youth research in the 1960s was quite buoyant, it was ascendant. There were people who studied youth work, youth services. There's a stream of research and serious writing on youth work in Britain that goes back to the end of the 19th century. And it continued in the 1960s, and it continues to the present day. And I think it is very, very well represented at this conference. There was also a great deal of interest in youth deviance, delinquency. People working in this field were inventing a new criminology. They had a National Deviance Symposium. They were inspired by symbolic interactionist perspectives and more specifically by a labelling theory of deviance, and that was an exciting development. There was also a stream of research into the post-war youth cultures, who were in a sense the competitors of the established youth services. The best known interventions there were from Birmingham University's Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, and transition into work from education. Well, it was not a public issue. It was not a political issue, because young people simply left school and got jobs. There was full employment. So it was not a problem. But I thought there was a problem, which was how young people came to settle so acquiescently into working lives in jobs that were not at all inspiring and were quite mundane and modestly rewarded. Other sociologists who were working in this field of youth employment were asking the same question. David Ashton at University of Leicester, and somewhat later Paul Willis at Wolverhampton. Why the hell weren't they rioting? Well, we all gave slightly different answers, but I think they were complementary. But it was an issue for me because I haven't settled. I left school when I was 16 and worked for 4 years in a bank, a retail bank. When you do this, you can see the rest of your life planned before you, the jobs you'll be doing in 5, 10, 40 years. And my own reaction was that I needed to get out. And I could do, because I had the opportunity to go to university. But most were not jumping. They were settling. So why was this? I still ask this question. Because in my ideal world, work would be organised somewhat differently. But we're not having my ideal world right at the moment. Now, then and now, in the 1960s, and now at this conference, if I say that the types of employment that young people move into are determined primarily by where they live, by place, country, region within country, city, sometimes local labour market within a city, and then by family class origin, and also by education, the institution you've attended and its reputation and the qualifications with which you leave. If I say that here, it's not controversial, is it? Not at all. And to an audience of sociologists in the 1960s, it was not controversial, but it was. To the professional group who were listening, who were youth employment officers, subsequently called careers officers, who were responsible for advising young people while they were at school, and also following up their progress into the labour market. Now, they had all been trained on a diet of psychology and theories about the development of occupational choices, which they were intended to facilitate. Young people would gradually come to identify the kind of occupations that would be right for them, and then assisted by the Youth Employment Service, they would move into these occupations and be happy ever after. I was saying no, that it is opportunity. Now, young people do have to exercise agency. They must exercise agency in applying for jobs. And if offered a job, they must exercise agency in saying yes. But they can only say yes to offers they get, right? And often the offers are quite narrow. And although there might be full employment, you hesitate to turn an offer down if it's reasonably close to what you want to do, because you don't know whether you'll be offered anything better. So that's what became opportunity structure theory, and it's had legs. Because ever since then, problems in assimilating young people into the labour market have been attributed to deficiencies in young people, right? Their education has been wrong, right? It's not been sufficiently vocational, or it's not trained them in the right occupational skills. So they've got to be prepared better and made more employable. And moving right into the present. I mean, universities now think it's part of their mission to teach employability to their students. Yeah? Now, when I tell you this, the place where people become employable is actually in employment. Where you learn what you need to do in order to satisfy the organisation, the employer. And I also tell you this, that the place where most occupational skills are learned is in employment. Yes. It is not in classrooms. And if the jobs are there, you find that young people are eminently employable. But the battle for ideas, it continues and it's never ending. So opportunity structure theory, yeah, it's lived. Now, I might have left it at that. As Robert said, I'm a youth researcher, but not only. And I stuck around in the field because in the 1970s, youth employment did become a public issue, a matter of political interest. And that was because of unemployment. Yeah. During the 1970s, levels of unemployment in Britain were rising. And among young people, the levels were higher than among adults. And from 1976 onwards, the government had special measures intended to get young people into the workforce. There were new training schemes. There were new courses in education. And also an increase in the numbers of young people who were continuing their education beyond the minimum leaving age along the old normal routes. And it's in this context that a transition paradigm emerged for studying how young people did move from education to work. Yeah? There was social origins, right? Place, education, family, class. There was a steps you next took through post-compulsory education and training, and then there was a job in which you settled for the, as far as you know, for the longer term. Though the longer term mightn't be forever, but it was a job in which you were not looking to, it was not finite duration, like an educational course or a training scheme. You're there for as long as both the employer and you consider it satisfactory. So the transition paradigm, which young people from different class and educational backgrounds in specific places follow which routes and the types of employment to which they lead. I'm under heading 2. Now, I expect this maybe to be a bit more controversial. I mean, towards the end of the 1980s, in a research group with which I was involved, one of the members, Claire Wallace, who was a prominent youth researcher at the time. This lit, you see, if you want to have bright ideas, pinch somebody else's Claire put it to us that the entire sociology of youth should be a sociology of youth transitions. Now, the transition from education to work has lengthened, yeah, as a result of all the different routes that have been introduced through which you had to move in order to get into employment proper. Simultaneously, other youth life stage transitions have lengthened. Age of first marriages was going up. Age of leaving the parental home, age of home ownership was going up. And rather than one step, there were several moves. Yeah. So you could extend this thinking into all spheres of life. For instance, in different forms of civic participation. You can study young people's careers as political activists. And it is misleading to sort of generalize about so many young people do this or so many young people do that. Because between the age of 18 and 24 or 18 and 30, whatever age group you're talking about, young people's lives do not stay static. There's a paper in the latest papers in Journal of Youth Studies by here. Nuno de Almeida Alves, is she here?
That's a he and he's not.
Well, I may have got the pronunciation wrong, but it is a study of young people who've become active members of a militant left-wing group. And it's about their journeys through earlier years of youth into their current positions. And it's for the people who are politically active, they're not suddenly active and static, yes, they change. Just as people gradually change their relationships with their families of childhood as they move through youth, and in all spheres of life. In pursuing their taste in music, people aged 16 are not going to continue to do it in exactly the same way until they're in their late 20s. So the argument is that any accurate, valid representation of any part of young people's lives has to incorporate a dimension of movement. People gradually change. And so the transition paradigm, origins, roots to destinations, should be generally applied across the youth studies field. Now, I don't expect that to happen. Because, well, one of the attractive things about studying youth is that it's a window into so many aspects of life in society. It intersects with education, the economy, politics, consumption, everything. So you can move from youth, and also youth is an indicator of how societies in general are changing. So at this conference here, I mean, you could hear presentations that are about gender divisions, which are about expressions, how people express masculinity and femininity. And they don't necessarily have to engage with the transition paradigm. though I think that ideally they should. But then, other people do not necessarily follow. That's heading 2 on the screen. Because I'd say that during my career there have been two big changes. One was in the 1970s when youth unemployment becomes an issue, and people like me studying transition into work become central actors in the youth research field rather than marginal. And the other change occurs around end of the 1980s and the 1990s, when there is a big expansion of the number of youth researchers. I mean, higher education in many countries has been expanding from 1980s and through the 1990s. More students are studying not just sociology, but childhood and youth studies, popular areas of specialization, and there are more people employed teaching these courses, and they are writing papers and they're attending conferences. And the number of journals in which youth researchers can publish expands. And journals that had once been national in their readership and the authors that they recruited, that they become international. So in 1997, the British Journal of Educational Work drops British from the title. In 1998, the Journal of Youth Studies is born, and it's an international journal from the outset. I mean, in Europe, this internationalization is facilitated by the European Union and the European Commission funding multi-country studies that bring researchers in different countries together. It's also facilitated by the adoption of English as the international language, for which we are grateful. But then we find that the foreigners are learning to do English better than we do. And that's not fair, is it? But, I mean, suddenly, it seems to me suddenly, I mean, the most attended conferences are international conferences. But was anybody here in Porto last week? Oh, conference grouping, yes. I mean, there are these few windows in which it's possible to have academic conferences when people are available. One is in early September, so they tread on each other's toes. I mean, in the 1990s, there were various networks on youth research, international networks that were being established. Some didn't last very long. But one that has is the European Network on Transitions in Youth. Anybody heard of it? Yes, good. I mean, its initial meeting was in Barcelona in 1993, and it has met annually ever since. And this year, its meeting is this week in Warsaw. And I would be there, but I'm here. I mean, the calendar becomes cluttered. Because I think we should recognise there's a limit to this internationalisation, and to the adoption of English as the agreed language of inter-country communication, we have lost the Francophone community. They use French. The French language countries, countries that were once part of the French Empire and also French part of Canada, we don't really have the Russian language community, not to mention the Chinese. Yeah? There are limits to exactly who participates in different international networks, but nevertheless, we have them. Now, I find that there are problems in this expansion and internationalization. One is that although more papers are being written and more papers are being published, I can't increase the amount of reading that I do. And I think there might be an inverse relationship between the number of papers that are published and the number that are read. Possibly. But if in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, I was researching young people in Britain, and I was writing just for a British audience. And the conferences I went to were conferences in Britain, where the other researchers were all from Britain. And I think I could keep abreast of everything that was being produced. Yeah. Now, I can't. And I think that is I experienced that as a problem. It's also the case that I think with international research it is much more difficult than when studying just one country to generalize about youth across Europe or globally. I was involved in the European Network on Transition to Youth in its early years, when the main issue that was being addressed was the transition into work that had become more difficult, more complicated in country after country. Members of the group had been conducting, in some cases, longitudinal studies of young people's progress from compulsory education and onwards as they move towards employment. Now, when researchers presented their findings, we found ourselves, well, we expected it, we knew, that we were hearing about educational institutions with unfamiliar names and qualifications with names that were unfamiliar. Now, European countries there are many of them. I mean, the European country is divided into continents, it's divided into countries, all of which have their own language, their own national history. They all, in contrast to the United States, have multi-track education systems. At some point in their education, young people are split into different tracks. Now, the age when this happens varies. In Germany, it's age 10. I think in Netherlands, it's age 12. In France, it's 14. And 14 is the most common age throughout Europe. And here in the UK, it is 16. And similarly in the Nordic countries and in the Republic of Ireland. Now, I mean, these institutions are simply different. So you can say that the gymnasium in Germany is like the grammar school in Britain, but it is not just the same. Yeah? And young people in Germany do not just go to an academic secondary school, they go to the gymnasium that in Germany has its own particular reputation. And similarly, all the different vocational tracks that you might follow. So if you want accounts of young people's progress from school to working life that correspond with young people's own experiences, you have to have the detail of the local institutions, the particular schools, the particular courses, the specific qualifications that young people are following. So Rob MacDonald's research in Teesside, which I think many of you will know about, it's convincing because it has this local detail. And strip that out and just have young people getting to level 11 or level 12 or 13 or whatever the level is no real substitute. And I think, well, to me, this is a problem with which we are still, there is no solution. Because how many countries can you have all the details about how their institutions work? How many can you handle? I'm against what I call variable sociology. This is from the types of projects that the European Commission has often funded, with 12, 15, maybe more countries in them, in which you treat the countries as if they are a random sample of a larger population of countries and start working out what the level of unemployment is related to in terms of the organisation of earlier forms of education. Implication being that if other countries do it the way that those with low rates of unemployment do it, they'll get the same results, but they won't, because it doesn't work like that. So I think internationalisation, it's opportunities, yeah, but it also raises problems. And it doesn't eliminate the need for single country studies. And long live them. I think there were advantages in the age when you were just addressing a national audience and they were all familiar with the particular national context in which the research was done. I think there's problems we've not really solved, except with my transition paradigm. Now, I can't blow me on champagne. I mean, I've got to be able to self-advocate. That's here, isn't it? What I want to put to you is that questions that are addressed do travel well between countries. Origins, routes, destinations. You can pose the same questions anywhere. Yeah? About transitions from education to work, but also in other spheres of life. Yeah? Now the answers will vary from country to country. The answers do not travel well, yeah? But the questions do. I'm happy that I don't have a monopoly of advocacy here. And many people will do it differently. That is healthy. That's their choice. But I think asking the same set of questions about origins, roots, destinations is a way in which you can sort of produce order in what is otherwise a mass of detail. And switching to my bottom line, where I think we are looking into the future. I think intergenerational comparisons are important, and the same questions can be asked of different generations of young people, parents, current young people. Same questions that can be asked as when you're comparing different countries. How have parental origins changed? Because as societies change, so do the education of parents, so do the occupations, the class positions of parents of successive cohorts of young people. And roots change, and young people's destinations change. And this sort of comparison, I think, has to be done within countries. But it's one in which I think in Europe, as it's done in different countries, you will see the same results. There's another paper in latest papers in Journal of Youth Studies, and it's by, is she here? Violet Tucci. Is she not here to remember so I can say nice things? No. Oh, it's about, she's written a paper about housing transitions in Europe. Noting how there are some broad differences between European regions and how leaving the parental home or staying in the parental home has a different significance in different parts of Europe. If you are still living with your parents when you're age 30 in Ireland or in Britain or in Germany or in France or in the Nordic countries, there's a sort of assumption that this is due to some constraint, like economic, preventing you moving out. If you're from southern Mediterranean Europe, the family cultures are different. Young people can leave home for education, to go to a university in a different region. They can leave home for employment. There are better opportunities in another region. But if they can leave home to get married, and live with a partner, but simply to move out and stay in the same town, city, without getting married, it suggests something is wrong with the family that you've come from. Different meanings. But despite all this, I mean, across Europe, the typical ages when young people leave home, and also when they become owner-occupiers, they own the houses that they live in. The ages have been going up. The reason is a shortage of housing usually, which sends the price up beyond young people's means. And I think if we look at typical earnings at given ages, you will find, as is the case in Britain, that compared with their parents, young people are doing not as well today. Now, why is this? Why is this, you might ask? No, well, you might not ask. Rates of economic growth are somewhat sluggish. More of the output, the value of it, goes to asset holders, shareholders. Yeah? Among those, the proportion of the product that goes to labour, more of it goes to the top income groups, yeah? And the middle and the lower groups. Its pressure is downwards. And I think that will apply, we will find, in all Western European countries, but that's just a hypothesis for the moment. It requires national researchers to produce the evidence. And how can they get out of this? This is where we enter into political economy and the global political economy. There was an American sociologist called Wallerstein, who in the 1970s was advocating world systems theory. His view was that the entire world should they're in one global society, yeah? And different countries are subsystems within it. And the whole constellation changes over time due to the actions of the people in various countries in various positions. And I thought when I heard Wallerstein that I agree, but I can't do that. Though Wallerstein himself simply writes about the development of capitalism as a global economic system since the end of the Middle Ages, and his argument is it divides the world into core and peripheral countries. And I think you can add that it divides within countries the owners of capital, the owners of assets, and the rest. But I'm not a political economist. Limits, despite what Rob says, there are limits to what I can do, but there is still work to do for youth researchers. And so I will leave at some point, I will depart, but I hope I will leave it all in good hands. And you will consider the transition paradigm. Yeah, and opportunity structures. These have legs, these should travel, these should endure. So thank you.